good afternoon to you colleagues in Nairobi. My name is Clemencia Munoz and I am the head of the UN Women Training Center. I'm very glad to welcome you to this webinar session on the SDG Report Turning Promises into Action, Gender Equality in the 2030 Agenda, which is part of the course organized for the UN Country Team Gender Focal Points of Kenya. This program, as you know, is organized by UN Women Kenya with the support of UN Women's Training Center. Before we get started, allow me to outline how today's presentation is organized. First, we will briefly comment how the two-go webinar platform work. Secondly, we will listen and follow the content of today's presentation delivered by one colleague, expert, and participant in the development of this report. And finally, we will have the opportunity to pose some questions to our expert panelists through this online platform. Let's see how we're going to do this last question posing. As you can see in your monitors, you have a menu with options, and the right side at the right side of the screen. And in order to make a question, please add it on the available box below the question function where the black arrow is. Please note that you can type questions in this box at any time during the presentation. We will be compiling them during the session for the panelists to respond at the end. Finally, also, it is important to know that the webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to your course space at the e-learning campus, and it will be made available through our YouTube channel of easy access. Today's panelist, I'm very pleased to present my colleague Silke Staab. Silke works as a research specialist within the UN Women Research and Data section, where she manages the Global Report on Gender Equality in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. She holds a PhD in politics from the University of Manchester and has published widely on gender, care, and social policy. Before joining UN Women, Silke worked for different UN agencies and non-governmental organizations, including the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. I think you all know Mariangela, but I'd still like to introduce Mariangela Bizarri, who is facilitating the course, and that you will have the opportunity to meet her in person during the face-to-face part. Mariangela is a consultant with almost 20 years of experience and solid expertise on gender equality and women's empowerment, protection, and gender-based violence, particularly in humanitarian settings. She's also an accomplished trainer with considerable experience in the design and delivery of training and capacity building activities on gender targeted to diverse audiences. Now, without further ado, I leave you with Silke, who will present the findings of the report, Turning Promises into Actions. Silke, welcome, and thank you again for participating as a panelist.
Hello, good morning from New York to everyone. Thanks to Clemencia for the introduction, and thanks to all of you who take an interest in the report and are here today. The report Turning Promises into Action is relatively fresh. It was launched in the middle of February globally and is now kind of being rolled out regionally and nationally through launches. We actually had a launch event at the 8 Forum in Nairobi at the end of February, which some of you may have attended. And so I'll also partly draw on what we already presented there. It is the first report really of that kind to look at gender equality in the 2030 Agenda as a whole. And our starting point, in a way, are some of the cross-cutting principles that, for us, make the 2030 Agenda potentially so promising for women and girls. And that's the principle of universality, that the agenda applies to all countries, rich and poor, and has to be achieved for all people without discrimination. The principle of leaving no one behind, and we'll see in the presentation that that is not only not leaving women and girls behind. Women and girls are not one group, they're not all the same, and there are groups of women and girls who are at particular risk and particularly vulnerable, and whose plight is very often hidden behind national averages. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the most important, I think, commitment of the 2030 agenda is to not only dedicate a whole goal to gender equality and women's empowerment, which goes much beyond what we had in the MDGs and really includes some of the very strategic gender equality issues that we work on, but also that gender equality is recognized as an important contributor, as a catalyst, and as something that has to be factored in to our work on all the other 16 goals. And so that's really our starting point. And with that in mind, what we do in the report are four big things. We look at gender equality across all the 17 SDGs, showing that in many areas progress is too slow to achieve the target for women and girls by 2030. We conduct in-depth analysis of 4 countries to see which groups and women and girls are being systematically left behind, and we provide concrete recommendations for accelerating progress. Another thing that we do is that we look at the global indicator framework and identify the gender-specific indicators across all 17 goals with which we can measure progress for women and girls. So I'll give you a little bit of a taste of what is in the report in the next 15-20 minutes. As I said, the report is the first of its kind to look at gender equality across the 2030 agenda as a whole. We provide a detailed account of the status of women and girls under SDG 5, but we also show that gender inequalities remain pervasive in all the other 16 goals. And I can't go through all 17 of them. You'll find kind of a spotlight approach for each of the goals in the global report in chapter 3, but I'll give you a few examples. Starting with SDG 1 on the next slide. So here we use new data to show and substantiate what many of us have long known, that women are more affected by poverty than men. And we used a new database together with the World Bank, analyzed the data for 89 countries, showing that globally women are about 4 percentage points more likely to live in extreme poverty than men. But what we also show, and that's interesting and disconcerting, when we disaggregate it by age, we find that across all regions, the gender gap in extreme poverty widens significantly among people who are between 25 and 34 years old. That's where the blue and red lines on the graph part ways about in the middle. And so globally, there are 122 women aged 25 to 34 for about every 100 men of the same age group living in extremely poor households. In sub-Saharan Africa, the gap is even wider than the global one. So here we have a relation of 100 men and 127 women living on less than $1.90 a day. And so we also asked, why do we see this pattern and why is it so pervasive really globally? It's not regionally specific, right? We see this in all regions. So these are peak productive years where many women and men are earning a living to sustain themselves and their families, but they're also prime reproductive years where many of them have small children to support and to look after. And the fact that for this particular age group, women are so much more likely to be poor than men just shows that the responsibility for reconciling production and reproduction, for reconciling income earning and family life, falls disproportionately on their shoulders. And for many women, this implies really harsh trade-offs, either leaving their children unattended or sacrificing an income that could lift them and those very children out of poverty. And this predicament is most pressing for the poorest women, who not only tend to have children at an earlier age, but are also more likely to raise them without significant support by fathers. And for this to change, we obviously need men to do more, but we also need, we argue in the report, a supportive policy framework that enables women and men to care for their loved ones without being condemned to poverty. We dedicate a whole chapter to care policies, but there are also other policies that are extremely important, also in the region, including social protection, which is key to poverty eradication, but more needs to be done to make social protection policies gender responsive and also sensitive to ongoing changes in family and household structures. And another important component are infrastructure investments like water, sanitation, and energy, which would free up time that women currently spend on reproductive tasks like water collection for domestic consumption. So that's the example of Goal 1. I want to say a little bit about some of the targets under Goal 5. On the next slide, we see that violence against women and girls is rampant across regions and countries. It's one of the most pervasive human rights violations in the world today. The blue bar shows the prevalence of women who report physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner in the last 12 months. That's 1 in 5, or 19%. Sub-Saharan Africa is above that average with 22.3%, and in Kenya, 1 in 4 women reported experiencing physical and or sexual violence in 2014. And so clearly, without addressing this global pandemic, many of the other goals of the agenda will remain elusive, including Goal 16 on peaceful and inclusive societies. We also have a whole chapter in the report dedicated to violence against women policies, and what we show is that there has been significant progress in terms of laws. Today, there are 3/4 of all countries that have laws in place to address violence against women, but in many, implementation remains weak. Services for survivors, such as shelters, healthcare, legal assistance, and so on, need to be strengthened to ensure that women are safe and able to rebuild their lives. And we also show that specific support mechanisms are needed for groups who face additional barriers, additional discriminations, like women with disabilities, older women, adolescent girls, indigenous women, and so on. And as UN Women colleagues know, most importantly, and that's a strong focus of UN Women's work, we need to get much better at preventing violence before it happens by challenging the unequal gender power relations that lie at its root. We also look at harmful practices, including child early and forced marriage. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but basically what we find is that globally there are 750 million women and girls who were married before the age of 18. Sub-Saharan Africa is the region with the second highest prevalence. And though in many countries rates are declining, it's important to know that the absolute figure of women married before the age of 18 will actually keep on rising if we don't accelerate the pace of decline, just because of population dynamics and population growth. And something similar we find for FGM. At least 200 million women and girls in 30 countries have undergone this practice. Sub-Saharan Africa has some of the countries with the highest prevalence rates, including Djibouti, Guinea, Mali, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and Sudan. We also present cohort analysis for Kenya, showing that the practice has actually declined quite significantly. So in the generation of women who are today 45 to 49, we have had a prevalence of 41% compared to 15% of women who are now aged 20 to 24. So that's good news. And also in the chapter on violence, we discuss some of the good practices that can help decrease and eliminate this practice. We look at SDG 2 on ending hunger and achieving food security, drawing on data from 141 countries, developed and developing, showing that in 2/3 of these countries, women are more likely than men to report food insecurity. And that's really quite ironic, given that women play such a pivotal role in agricultural production, but also in food processing and preparation. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest overall prevalence of food insecurity, and the rates are staggering for both women and men. More than half of the population is food insecure at moderate or severe levels, and slightly more women report food insecurity than men regionally. The greatest gender gap in the region we find in Namibia, with 9 percentage points to the detriment of women. In Kenya, more than half of the population is food insecure, but the gender gap is not very pronounced, and men actually present slightly higher levels of food insecurity than women. However, even in countries where gender gaps are not very pronounced, we know that in times of food scarcity, women often act as shock absorbers. They have been shown to consume less nutritious food, to leave the best for their families, and also to spend significantly more time and energy to secure and process food for domestic consumption. The last example I want to give is from the environmental arena, and here we look at SDG 15, where we see that between 2010 and 2015, the world lost 3.3 million hectares of forest areas, and that's obviously a huge environmental problem, but it's also a human problem, and it's also a problem of gender inequality, because poor rural women, especially those from landless households, are particularly affected by this depletion. Given their roles in cooking, cattle care, and related tasks, they often depend on forests for firewood, fodder, and food items for daily survival. And the more forests recede, the further they have to walk to collect these items. And so, for example, a study in Malawi found that deforestation was forcing women to walk more than 10 kilometers a day to collect fuel wood. And in countries like Zambia and the United Republic of Tanzania, women spend between 300 and 800 hours a year on this task. And this is exacerbated in many countries by large-scale land expropriation, so-called land grabs, that further restrain access to forest resources. So that was kind of a bit of an overview of what we do goal by goal, drawing on official statistics. And these official statistics often assess outcomes based on national, regional, or global averages. And so on the next slide, which draws on chapter 4, we argue that averages are really important to get a sense of general trends, etc., but they also mask inequalities among social groups, doing injustice to those at the bottom, and also often masking the extreme privileges that we see at the top. And so what we show in chapter 4 is that women and girls who experience multiple forms of discrimination often fare worse than the average across a range of SDG-related indicators. And we show that by looking at microdata from 4 countries: Colombia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and the United States. And what we find really is that deprivations cluster to produce acutely disadvantaged groups, so women and girls who are not only married early, but then also face disadvantages in education, employment, and so on. So I wanted to give you the example of Nigeria on the next slide. We find that being poor and married at an early age in Nigeria, so girls from poor households are significantly more likely to be married at an early age, and then that makes these girls much more likely to drop out of school, to give birth at an early age, to suffer complications during childbirth, and experience violence in later life. So several dimensions of the 2030 agenda that become compromised, and at the end of this chain of events, the chances for these girls or women to move out of poverty are really minimal. And I just wanted to draw on the next slide on the Nigeria example a bit more to give you a sense of what is really hidden behind the averages. So for education, for example, education outcomes, we find a very strong wealth effect. So on average, we have 55% of Nigerian women who are education poor, meaning that they have 6 or less years of formal education. But education poverty is almost universal among women who live in the poorest income quintiles. Whereas for those who live in the richest households, the figure is a mere 13% and 97% for the poorest women. For child marriage, in Nigeria, 47% of women overall aged 18 to 49 were married before 18, but wealth, ethnicity, and location pushed this number up even further. For example, among Hausa women from the poorest rural households, the rate stands at 88%. And then finally, while 59% of women in Nigeria still lack access to skilled birth attendants, and that number is significant, rates are even higher again among specific groups of the population. And in this case, for example, the most disadvantaged group are poor Fulani women in rural areas, where the rate stands at 96%. So almost universal lack of skilled birth attendants. So in a nutshell, the report shows that gender inequalities remains pervasive in all dimensions of sustainable development, but it also shows that even where progress is made, it is uneven, it can be fragile, and it certainly is not equally shared by women in different social groups. And so based on this, this kind of stock-taking exercise, we also provide a forward-looking agenda consisting of three big elements that we argue are critical for monitoring and accelerating change for women and girls: better data, greater accountability, and transformative policies. So in terms of data to monitor progress for women and girls, we need to really kind of become much better in capturing what is happening across all SDGs, across all countries, and also over time. For the report, we squeezed each and every global data source available, but the challenges for gender-sensitive monitoring are enormous. Of the total 232 indicators in the SDGs, we counted 54 as gender-specific. That's the official indicator framework. And gender-specific means that they explicitly call for disaggregation by sex and/or refer to gender equality as an underlying principle or objective. So maternal mortality, for example, is not a sex disaggregated indicator, but it is an indicator that refers specifically to women and gender equality outcomes. But these 54 indicators are not evenly spread across the 17 goals. Obviously, a lot of them are concentrated in goal 5, and the social goals like poverty, education, health are also not doing that badly. But there is 6 out of the total 17 SDGs that currently have no official indicator at all that tracks progress for women and girls. And that's true especially for the environmental goals, including Goal 6 on water and sanitation, Goal 7 on clean energy, Goal 15 on deforestation, and a couple of others. So what we do in the report is we use supplementary indicators to capture progress for women and girls, as well as qualitative evidence to tease out some of the gender dimensions of these goals. And I wanted to give one more example for what we do in this case for SDG 6, for example. We look at the distribution of households by the person who is usually responsible for water collection in households without access to water. The official indicator framework does not measure that. But what we find is that this responsibility falls disproportionately onto women and girls who are responsible for water collection in 80% of the cases. And we know, again, that this work is arduous, it takes a toll on women's health, it compromises their safety, and takes up time that cannot be used for other activities like paid work and education. So it really compromises women's progress across a range of SDGs. And so that's why investing in water infrastructure is very important for achieving SDG 6, but also for achieving gender equality as well as many other goals of the 2030 agenda. Returning to the issue of data, we also find that only 23% of the data needed to monitor the gender-specific indicators that we do have is recent. That is, it's from 2010 or later. The rate is slightly lower for Sub-Saharan Africa, but not much so. And only 16% is available for 2 or more points in time, meaning that we can actually monitor trends. So there are huge gaps to be filled in a sense, and if we're serious about tracking progress on gender equality, we need to invest in gender data and make sure they're collected and updated on a regular basis. Data is obviously critical for monitoring, it's critical for supporting decision making, but it's also critical for holding decision makers accountable for gender equality commitments. And this requires not only a revolution in gender data, we argue, but also a sea change in democratic governance. And we provide some recommendations at the national, regional, and global level how we can strengthen accountability. So, for example, when localizing their global commitments, member states should define clear responsibilities for fulfilling gender equality commitments and also allocate sufficient resources for their achievement. And one thing that is really critical at all levels is the participation of women's rights organizations in implementation and monitoring. Without the mobilization of these organizations, we would not have achieved the level of commitment to gender equality and the number of targets on gender equality and indicators that we have. And without their participation, similarly, we will fail to deliver gender responsive implementation. Finally, we also say that there is room for improvement at the global level with a high-level political forum that is again coming up in July. And that can, in our view, become a stronger platform for accountability if we allocated more time to voluntary national reporting, more time to peer review, and also more time for civil society to feedback into and comment on national voluntary reviews. Finally, we need transformative policies to achieve sustainable change at scale. And what we show in the report is that really essential services on which millions of women and girls depend, health, water, childcare, shelters, etc., are chronically underfunded or simply unavailable in many countries. And where they exist, they are often the first to be hit by fiscal retrenchment and austerity measures, which are, as we also show in the report, once again on the rise, both globally and in the region. And while the private sector can play a useful role in many instances, we also show that recent experience with water privatization in particular also shows the limits of private sector engagement in these areas. Poor rural and remote areas can be neglected because the initial capital investment can be heavy and full cost recovery through high charges unlikely. And so it's really a perfect candidate for the public sector and for public investments. And doing so, not only in water, but also in childcare, which is the other example I wanted to mention, would not only benefit women, but can yield benefits across a range of goals and targets of the 2030 agenda. So childcare services is one of the examples that we look at a bit more closely in the report. And what we show is that investing in their expansion could advance a number of child and gender-related targets, reducing the time women spend on unpaid care, enabling them to increase their access to employment, creating jobs in the social service sector, so contributing to Goal 8, and also contributing to children's development in education, health, and nutrition, particularly among children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so because this is such an important area, for the report, we also looked at what it would cost to extend free childcare services for children under the age of 5 in 2 countries, Uruguay and South Africa. And I know that this exercise is currently being replicated in some of our country offices. And so on the next slide, we show some of the figures on South Africa, where making these services universally available for all children under 5 would take a gross annual investment of 3.2% of GDP. This is obviously a significant fiscal outlay, but we also show that the potential returns are high, so the expansion could create 2 to 3 million new jobs, and raise female employment rates by 10 percentage points. And that's really quite significant, especially in a country like South Africa that struggles with really high unemployment rates. And in addition, the new tax and social security revenue from these newly created jobs would help recover more than a third of the initial fiscal outlay. So the net new investment would actually be reduced to 2.1% of GDP. And that's only one example. There are more in the report, and maybe also more from your side in the comments, questions, and discussion. So I just want to end by saying the report is in many ways, I think, a useful tool because it provides a reality check on where we stand and shows how much remains to be done to advance women's rights across all dimensions of sustainable development. But it also provides a roadmap for making change happen through gender-responsive policies and processes. And so we hope that it'll be a useful tool for all policy actors who strive to turn the 2030s Agenda promises into action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silke. It was so interesting. We have already 2 questions from Julia Bukarum. Please, dear participants, do not hesitate to put comments or questions. It's the moment to do so. Silke is available for you. So the first question is, what are the countries under revision for this report? Colombia, USA, Pakistan, Nigeria?
Should I answer right away? Yeah? Or yeah?
Yes, we will do one by one.
So the report is a global report. So we review progress globally, taking global averages where we have sufficient country-level data available, as well as regional progress where we have sufficient country data available to construct regional averages. So it's mainly a report that traces progress at the regional and global level based on country-level data. But the report has one chapter where we look in greater depth at a few countries across region to show these inequalities among women. So it's also not, it's country studies that focus on a very specific part of the 2030 Agenda, which is the promise to leave no one behind, and where we show for Colombia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and the United States of America that this promise really remains unfulfilled for specific groups of women. And that's also a bit of a call to say, yes, it's important to have these gender indicators and monitor progress at the national level, but we also need to look behind these national averages to really determine who are we leaving systematically behind, right? Who do we need to reach as a matter of priority within specific countries? And what we see across these case studies, especially in the more developing region, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Colombia, is that rural and lower income women are really at the end of the queue and across many indicators, yeah? So they really face compound disadvantages. Yeah, and so in all these countries, this then also mixes with race and ethnicity, but geographic location and income are really 2 very important stratifiers. So it's a call for further disaggregation as well.
Okay, maybe they are interested in knowing if you have specific data on Kenya, or?
So there's in the report itself, there's not a lot of country level data on Kenya, but there is an annex that shows which indicators, which of the 54 gender specific indicators, right, are available for Kenya. And most of the national level data for Kenya that we use in the report is available in the SDG indicator database that is you can find at the UN Statistical Organization website. So there you can look into national level data. So in the report, we work mostly with regional and global aggregates.
Okay, so the recommendation would be to first identify those indicators and work on those, no?
So the report, so what you can do with the report and the annex is to look at where is Kenya not so great in terms of data availability on gender, right? So that data is in the report. And then you can find kind of the latest globally available data for Kenya on most of the indicators that we discuss in the report in the online database.
Okay. The second question of Julia is, any policy support had been developed or under development in any country that's seen successful so far?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Any policy support had been developed or under development in any country that's seen successful so far? I suppose that, yeah, it's if we have successful policy or...
Yeah, the report, so that is one thing that we really wanted this report to do, right? We wanted the report to be a monitoring report that looks at outcomes and traces progress, but to make progress, right, we need policies. We need policies that work for women and girls. And so we wanted the report also to have a strong policy emphasis, but since the 2030 agenda is so vast, we chose 2 strategic areas for policy recommendations to focus on in this report, and that's violence against women and unpaid care, which are 2 targets under Goal 5, and also 2 targets that had not previously been included in the MDGs, and that women's organizations really lobbied for quite strongly. And in these 2 chapters, that's chapter 5 and 6 in the report, there are lots of kind of good practices and good examples of policies that have made a difference in these 2 areas. One that comes to mind in the violence chapter is a program, a community-based kind of action program that has been pioneered in Senegal, I think, and contributed significantly to reducing FGM, for example. Then in the care chapter, we have several examples, particularly also from Latin America, which I think can be a big inspiration for other regions, where there's a trend towards constructing national care systems. So really looking at what are the care needs among children, among the elderly, among people with disabilities, and how can we respond to that with, social protection, service provision, and other measures. So yeah, there are, in these 2 areas, there are many kind of, I think, positive examples that can serve as a inspiration.
Okay. Sorry, I think you started to respond to the question of Winnie. She says, I'm not clear on how exactly we can reduce time spent on unpaid care.
Yes, so then I would say read chapter 6. You'll find lots of ways to do that. But just to mention, I think too, so maybe I have to kind of start a bit broader. So unpaid care and domestic work is both, right, the person-to-person care. So it's looking after children, looking after the elderly, giving them a bath, taking them to the doctor, accompanying them in doing different kind of tasks of daily living. But it's also everything that makes this work possible, right? It's the cooking, it's the cleaning, it's all of that kind of domestic work that also makes the other person-to-person care work possible. And what we show in the report, and what also the water figures showed, is that especially in poor rural contexts and communities, but also in marginalized urban areas, women have to spend a lot of time just creating the preconditions for unpaid care work. So they have to go and collect firewood to be able to heat their stoves and prepare a meal. They have to go and collect water, and then a lot of times take that water back to their homes and treat the water, boil the water or treat it so it actually becomes apt for domestic consumption. So investing in services that bring water closer to the home, make it more affordable. Similarly, energy and electricity is a really important precondition to reducing that time that women spend.
Okay, Nyambura has 3 questions related more with the report. How often will the report be produced? This is the first one.
Mm-hmm. Do you just want to give me the 3 and then I'll answer?
Okay. Will summary presentations be made available to UN Women country offices to help them disseminate the report, for instance, to SDG interagency working groups? That's the second one. And the third one is, did the report refer to the voluntary national reports that some countries produced for the high-level HLPF forum? Yes.
Yeah. These are really, really great questions, and I'm glad that you're asking them. I'm going to start with the second one because I think it's the most important one. We do rely on all of you, and we hope that the report is a useful tool for all of you to be used at the national and the regional level. We have sent through the program division out a launch kit that includes loads of material in several languages, in French and English and Spanish, etc. It includes a standard presentation of the report. It includes regional fact sheets that also have some country level data, but mostly regional averages. It includes social media messages and so on. So that is available. If you have not received it, please drop me a line, and I'm happy to kind of share all of that with you, and also keep us in the loop of what you're doing with the report. That's important for us as we fundraise for the next edition, to kind of show that there is an interest in uptake as well. So that was the second question. How often will it be produced? We're now, after this first version, thinking about what would be most useful in terms of our SDG monitoring work, in terms of products over the next kind of 5 years. We think it would be really good to do another, but that's preliminary thinking, big stock-taking report halfway through the agenda, but definitely have something annual or biannual that keeps on tracking progress, and maybe also goes a bit deeper into specific areas of the 2030 agenda. So it's currently under discussion, but the work will be ongoing, and we hope to produce something regularly. And we also hope to produce something around the same time as this year, February, so it can really feed into the regional discussions, into the preparation of the VNRs, and into the high-level political forum. And we've had really good experiences in launching the report, for example, at a couple of the regional forums for sustainable development. The report does refer to the VNRs of 2016 and 2017 in Chapter 1, where we discuss a little bit the follow-up and review architecture. So also for all of you who are not quite sure how this whole process works from the national, regional to the global level, there's an infographic there that describes the process and also refers to the VNRs and how well they've done. But we do want to continue that work, and we're working with our intergovernmental colleagues as well to continue the evaluation of the VNRs each year to see, and how far do they take gender into account, and so on. So I hope I've answered all 3 questions with that.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Alexandra. Alexandra is working with us here in the training center as an intern. So she says, I understand that the South Africa you have done for South Africa, you've done a case study to show how much childcare will cost. Often, to convince governments to work toward the goal, there must be an economic incentive too. Have you been able to provide other examples where your findings prove that progress in this area will be good for the economies of these countries?
The question is beyond childcare services.
Yes.
Yeah. We do.
Or maybe for other countries.
So the childcare services, I think, has been an interesting exercise. It's been quite laborious also in terms of all the data that needs to go into it. So we've done it so far for 3 countries, but we're working with our economic empowerment team as well, because we've had quite a lot of interest from country offices to replicate that costing. And that costing for the childcare services shows only the direct returns, right? It only shows the financial returns in terms of taxes and social security contributions that you get from creating more jobs in this area. But what we also know from research and the literature in general is that childcare services have huge long-term and medium-term benefits, right? That are more social, or that kind of pay off like 10 years into this future, when the children are better prepared for the labor market, right? When the women have not interrupted their employment participation to take care of their children for prolonged periods of time, et cetera, et cetera. In Chapter 6, which looks at different care-related policies, we don't do a costing of this kind, but we do show in each of the policy areas that we discussed that include investments in infrastructure, as well as investments in long-term care services for dependent older people, that investing in these areas pays off across different targets of the agenda. And I think that's a really important thing for us to look for catalytic policies, right, that benefit women, but that also allow us to tackle other dimensions of the 2030 agenda. And that's a good argument. I mean, that should be an attractive argument for governments as well, who are striving to meet different goals and targets, to say, hey, you know, with this, you can really, you know, make progress across a bunch of targets and goals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Silke. We don't have any other questions now, and it's 8:53, so I will give the floor to Clemencia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Clemencia?
Thank you very much, Silke, for the presentation. I think we had a very good participation and questions, and we look forward to continue this conversation with the gender focal points. As for the gender focal points, as we said, the webinar is being recorded and will be available. I understand the report is available for free in the webpage of UN Women in 3 languages. So please feel free to take a look at the report, and thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, Silke. Thank you, participants, and have a good day or good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.